Hello and welcome to IAMC Radio and Podcast. Let's explore some of the top news headlines today, March 6th. We're starting off in Nigeria with a story about Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduagan. She's been suspended from the Senate for 6 months. This comes after she accused Senate President Godswill Akpabio of sexual harassment.
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation. You see, the Senate Committee on Ethics and Public Petitions, they recommended this suspension. They cited a violation of Senate standing rules, but at the same time, they also dismissed Natasha's petition against Akpabio. Apparently, there was a procedural error. She signed the petition herself.
So she's being punished even though her petition was dismissed. And the consequences, they seem to go beyond just the suspension itself.
Oh, absolutely. The committee also recommended withholding her salary and allowances, and that includes the salaries and allowances for her aides. They even want to withdraw her security escorts.
Wow.
This suspension, it's effective immediately, and she's barred from even being in the National Assembly vicinity.
It seems like they're really trying to send a strong message here.
It definitely raises questions about how these kinds of serious allegations are handled within the Nigerian Senate and what kind of impact this will have on, others who might want to come forward.
Yeah, it's a disturbing precedent. Now, shifting gears a bit, there's another story out of Nigeria that has caught our attention. The Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the EFCC, has arrested former Akwa Ibom State Governor Udom Emmanuel. This is over alleged fraud, a huge amount of money, and $700 billion.
Wow. So this arrest, it stems from a petition by the Network Against Corruption and Trafficking, ACAT. And they've outlined some very serious accusations: money laundering, fund diversion, and financial mismanagement, all during his time as governor from 2015 to 2023.
It sounds like they're alleging a pattern of corruption. The petition claims that despite receiving over N3 trillion from the Federation account, Emmanuel left the state with a N500 billion debt and get this N300 billion worth of unfinished projects.
If that's true, that's a lot of money unaccounted for. And it gets worse. The investigation apparently revealed that N31 billion was withdrawn in cash from an account simply labeled Office of the Governor.
That's a pretty vague description for such a large sum of money. These accusations are very serious. It'll be interesting to see how this case develops. Now let's turn our attention to some international news. U.S. Senator Alyssa Slotkin has come out and publicly criticized President Trump. This is over his handling of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, specifically his recent clash with Ukrainian President Zelensky.
Yeah, Slotkin's been very vocal about this. She's drawing a contrast between Trump's approach and the peace through strength strategy, the one associated with President Reagan.
And she hasn't held back. She's even said that she believes Trump's actions could have put the outcome of the Cold War at risk. That's a pretty strong statement. And on a similar note, Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester, also Democrat, she's pointed a finger at President Trump's tariffs, claiming that they're directly responsible for the rising costs that Americans are facing.
So these tariffs, they've led to trade wars with a number of countries: Canada, Mexico, China. And Senator Blunt Rochester argues that these policies, well, they prioritize disruption and personal gain over the well-being of American citizens.
So she's essentially saying that Trump is putting his own interests ahead of the country's. It definitely adds fuel to the fire of the debate surrounding the impact of these trade policies.
Yeah.
Now let's hop across the pond to the UK. They're introducing a new travel requirement, the Electronic Travel Authorization, or ETA.
Right. So starting today, travelers from Europe will need to apply for this authorization. It's similar to the U.S. USTA system, and you'll need it for any short visits to the UK.
So essentially, it's another hoop to jump through for travelers. What's the cost involved, and how long is this authorization valid for?
Well, the application fee right now is £10, but heads up, it's going up to £16 in April. The good news is that once you're approved, it's valid for 2 years, and you can use it for multiple visits as long as each visit is less than 6 months.
It's good to know, especially for people who travel frequently.
Oh, and one more thing. There's an exception to this rule. If you're just passing through a UK airport without actually going through immigration, like if you have a layover, you won't need an ETA.
And that makes sense, especially with all the traffic at major hubs like Heathrow. Now, circling back to Nigeria for a moment, there's some concerning news about the country's position on the Global Terrorism Index. Nigeria has moved up to 6th place in the 2025 index.
Oh, wow. That's a big jump from their previous ranking of 8th.
It is, and it's largely due to an increase in terrorism-related deaths. There were 565 recorded in 2024.
That's still significantly lower than the 2,101 fatalities back in 2014, but the upward trend is definitely worrying.
It seems that despite efforts to combat terrorism, it remains a very real threat in Nigeria.
The report points to IS Sahel's expansion as a major factor in this rise in violence. They've been very active in the Liptako-Gorma region, and they've been extending their reach into neighboring countries like Nigeria.
So the problem is spreading. It raises concerns about their growing influence and the potential for further instability in the region. Now let's shift our focus to the U.S. The Supreme Court has made a significant ruling. They've blocked the Trump administration from withholding $2 billion in foreign aid.
So this was a 5-4 decision, and the court upheld a lower court's ruling that requires the administration to honor completed contracts for this aid.
This is particularly interesting given Trump's history with foreign aid. He's often sought cuts, especially at USAID. He's been very critical of that organization.
Right, and the dissenting justices in this case, they actually raised concerns about the authority of a single district court judge to compel these kinds of payments. So it really highlights the complexities of this issue.
It definitely raises questions about the balance of power between different branches of government. And it will be interesting to see how this decision impacts future foreign aid allocations. Now for our final story today, let's dive into the world of cryptocurrency and cybercrime. The U.S. Secret Service has seized $1.5 million from a Binance cryptocurrency account that was linked to Nigerian fraudster Awuroso Omakri.
Wow. So this seizure came after a number of victims filed complaints. They had fallen prey to a cryptocurrency investment scam that Omakri and his syndicate were running.
It sounds like a classic case of taking advantage of people's lack of knowledge about crypto.
Yeah, the investigation uncovered a whole network of fraudulent trading platforms. One of them was called TradePropel, and they were all designed to lure in unsuspecting investors.
So they were creating these fake platforms to make it look legitimate.
Exactly, and one of the tactics they used was called a pig butchering. This is where the scammers spend a lot of time building trust with their victims, often through social media interactions. And then once they have that trust, they exploit it. They push these victims into fake investment schemes.
It's a reminder that even in the digital age, the old con games are still alive and well.
Absolutely.
This case really emphasizes the importance of being cautious online.
Especially when it comes to investments. You really need to do your research and be wary of anything that seems too good to be true.
Now, the special agent who led this investigation, Special Agent Caulfield, he gave some insight into how this scam worked. Apparently, they used intermediary wallets to make it harder to trace the money.
So they were trying to cover their tracks?
Exactly. It just goes to show how sophisticated these cyber criminals are becoming, and how important it is for us to stay vigilant in the digital age.
Definitely.
We need to be aware of the risks and take steps to protect ourselves. It's a constant game of cat and mouse.
You said it. Yeah, it's a reminder that even with all the technology out there, that these scammers, they still rely on those old tactics, building trust and then taking advantage of people.
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale for sure. You really have to be careful with your investments, especially in the world of cryptocurrency.
And speaking of tricky situations, let's go back to the U.S. and China for a second. We talked about the trade war earlier, but there's more to it than just that.
You're talking about that statement from U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, right?
Yeah.
The one where he said the U.S. is prepared for war with China. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, especially considering China had just issued their own warning saying they were ready for any form of war if the U.S. didn't back down on those economic confrontations.
Yeah. It's a scary thought that something that starts as an economic disagreement could escalate into an actual military conflict. And this tension has been building for a while, ever since the Trump administration imposed those tariffs on Chinese imports. But it goes deeper than just trade. There's this geopolitical rivalry, this competition over technology, and these completely different ideologies.
It's like a tangled web of issues, and that makes the whole situation pretty volatile.
And it's not just between the U.S. and China either. Remember, Canada imposes retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports, too. It's like a domino effect. These trade wars, they can really shake up the global economy.
Prime Minister Trudeau even warned about the potential negative impact this could have on Americans. It's a reminder that we're all connected in this global economy. What happens in one place can definitely affect others. It's a situation that requires a lot of thought and understanding. We need to look at the historical context, the current dynamics, and what might happen in the future. All right, let's switch gears completely and talk about the UK's decision to introduce that mandatory electronic travel authorization, the ETA for travelers coming from Europe.
Right, so this new system, it started today, and it's all about improving border security and making it easier for visitors to enter the country.
So it's like that ECDS system they have in the US, right?
Yeah.
You have to apply online and pay a fee before you travel.
Exactly, and right now the fee is £10, but it's going up to £16 in April. But the good news is once you're approved, it lasts for 2 years, and you can use it for multiple visits as long as each one is under 6 months.
That's convenient, especially for frequent travelers.
Oh, and there's one exception to the rule. If you're just passing through a UK airport on a layover and you don't actually go through immigration, you don't need an ETA.
That makes sense. It would be a nightmare for those major hubs like Heathrow if everyone had to get an ETA just for a layover.
Yeah, they actually made that exception after Heathrow Airport put some pressure on them. It's a way to balance security concerns with the need to keep international travel running smoothly.
It'll be interesting to see how this new system works out in the long term, how it affects travel patterns and border security. Now back to Nigeria for a minute. We were talking about their rise in the Global Terrorism Index.
Right. It's a concern because it means the threat of violence and instability is still very real there.
Yeah, they moved up to 6th place in the 2025 index, which shows that despite their efforts to fight terrorism, it's still a major challenge.
And the fact that there were 565 terrorism-related deaths in 2024, that just emphasizes how fragile the progress is and how dangerous groups like IS Sahel can be.
IS Sahel, they're the ones operating in that Liptako-Gorma region, right? Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger.
That's right. And they've been expanding their reach into neighboring countries like Nigeria.
So it's not just contained to one area, it's spreading.
Exactly. And that's why the situation in that whole region is so volatile. Nigeria is definitely bearing the brunt of a lot of that violence.
It sounds like a very complex situation.
It is. The report actually talks about how ISL's expansion happened at the same time that violence was resurging in some areas that had been improving.
So it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
It's clear that the fight against terrorism needs to continue. They need to address the root causes of instability and really work towards peace and security in the region.
Absolutely. Now let's turn our attention back to the U.S. and that Supreme Court decision to block the Trump administration from withholding $2 billion in foreign aid.
Right, that was a big decision.
It really highlights the checks and balances in our government, the fact that the judiciary can step in and make sure the executive branch is following the law.
And it's especially significant considering how much President Trump has tried to cut foreign aid in the past.
Especially the U.S. side, he's been a vocal critic of theirs.
Yeah, and the dissenting justices, they brought up some interesting points about the authority of a single district court judge to force the administration to make those payments.
That raises questions about the separation of powers and whether the judiciary might be overstepping its bounds.
It's a complicated issue for sure, and it'll be interesting to see how this ruling affects things moving forward, how foreign aid is allocated and how the different branches of government interact.
All right, now for a story that combines technology finance and cybercrime. The U.S. Secret Service seized $1.5 million from a Binance cryptocurrency account that was linked to a Nigerian fraudster, Akwa.
That's a big bust.
It really shines a light on how cybercriminals are using the anonymity and decentralized nature of cryptocurrency to their advantage.
Yeah, they're taking advantage of the fact that it's harder to track transactions and identities in the crypto world.
The investigation uncovered a pretty sophisticated operation. They had a whole network of fake trading platforms. One of them was called Trade Propel.
So they were trying to create this illusion of legitimacy to trick people into investing.
Exactly, and they were using this tactic called pig butchering.
It's where they build trust with their victims over a long period of time, often through social media, and then once they have that trust, they convince them to invest in these fake schemes.
It's a reminder that even though we're in the digital age, these scammers are still using those classic con artist tactics.
Absolutely. They prey on people's emotions and their desire for quick profits.
The special agent in charge of the investigation, Special Agent Caulfield, he talked about how they use these intermediary wallets to hide the money trail.
So they were trying to make it as difficult as possible to trace the funds back to them.
It's a reminder that these cyber criminals are getting more and more sophisticated.
Definitely, and we need to stay one step ahead of them by being informed and taking precautions.
It's an ongoing battle to protect ourselves in this digital age. Yeah, it really shows how criminals are adapting to this new technology-driven world.
Absolutely, and it is a reminder that we need to stay informed about these scams and protect ourselves online.
Speaking of protection, let's go back to the UK's new electronic travel authorization, that ETA we talked about. We discussed how it works, but I think it's worth thinking about the bigger picture here.
You mean like what it means for the UK's approach to border security and their relationship with Europe now that Brexit has happened?
Exactly. I mean, on the surface, it's all about enhancing security and make things easier for visitors. But is there more to it than that? Could it be a way for the UK to have more control over who comes into the country? after leaving the EU?
It's definitely possible. The timing of it all coming right after those Brexit immigration talks definitely makes you wonder.
It's something to keep an eye on for sure, because it could have a real impact on travel and relations between the UK and Europe.
And speaking of impacts, let's circle back to the Nigerian Senate and their decision to suspend Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduagan.
Yeah, that case is troubling, not just because the whole due process issue, but also because it might discourage other people from coming forward with their own allegations.
It's a tough situation because you have to balance upholding the rules with making sure people feel safe enough to report serious accusations.
I think a lot of people will be watching to see what happens next with this case and what the Senate does, because it could set a precedent for how they handle these kinds of situations in the future.
Right, and speaking of precedents, that U.S. Supreme Court decision to block the Trump administration from holding back that $2 billion in foreign aid.
That ruling really shows how important those checks and balances are in our government. The judiciary can step in and make sure the executive branch isn't overstepping its boundaries.
And it's even more significant considering how President Trump has always tried to cut back on foreign aid, particularly to U.S. aid.
He's made his opinions on that very clear.
Yeah, and those dissenting justices, they brought up some interesting questions about how much power a single district court judge should have to force the administration to make those payments.
It makes you think about the separation of powers and whether the judiciary might be overreaching in this case.
It's a complex issue with a lot of implications for foreign aid and the relationships between different parts of our government.
Well said. And finally, let's take a moment to consider the escalating tensions between the U.S. and China. It's a situation that has the potential to change the world as we know it, driven by those trade disputes, the geopolitical rivalries, and the clash of ideologies.
The rhetoric coming from both sides is definitely worrisome. Those statements about being prepared for war, it's a scary thought.
It underscores the critical importance of diplomacy, open communication, and a commitment to finding peaceful solutions to these international disputes.
We can't forget how interconnected the global economy is, and these tensions could easily spill over into other areas. It's a situation that demands careful thought and understanding.
That's a great point. And with that, we come to the end of our exploration of today's top news headlines, stories from all around the world that highlight the challenges and the opportunities we're facing.
It's a complicated world out there, with everything from political scandals and economic uncertainty to technological advances and the growing threat of cybercrime.
Staying informed and thinking critically are more crucial than ever.
Absolutely.
We encourage you to keep digging into these stories, seeking out different viewpoints, and forming your own conclusions about the events that are shaping our world. Thank you for listening to today's top news headlines on IAMC Radio and Podcast.